Hey, welcome. Thank you for being here. Today, we're going to talk about how to build both strength and endurance simultaneously in as little training time in the week as possible. So, as always, here's the plan for the video. We'll first talk about what the minimum effective dose is for both strength training and endurance training. And what I mean by that is what is the least amount of training you can possibly do while still seeing results reliably over a long period of time in both strength and endurance. Because I think once you understand this, everything else just feels a bit more possible, and I think that matters itself. We'll then talk about some programming tactics for minimalist training specifically. And what I mean by this is what are the things you can do in a training program, in your training sessions, that are going to really maximize the results you get out of the effort you're putting in the context of a minimalist approach to training. And then finally, just to put all of this into practice, we'll talk about some example training splits. I'll give you like the splits themselves, as well as a few example training sessions and training weeks, just so we can see what it looks like, put into practice. So volume, or how much of strength training that you do, is measured by the number of sets per week, or rather number of sets taken somewhat close to failure per muscle group per week. So for instance, let's say you did 3 sets of a barbell bench press on a Monday, 3 sets of push-ups on a Wednesday, and 3 sets of an incline double bench press on a Friday. That would count as 9 sets of volume for the chest in that week. And of course, the shoulder and the triceps, stuff like that, are working those movements as well. How you would quantify volume for those muscles, like the ones that aren't quite the prime mover of the movement, can get a little bit messier, and that's not really super relevant to this discussion today. The main point that is worth discussing here is that the minimum effective dose, as far as volume is concerned, for building muscle is 4 sets per muscle group per week. And I hope you can appreciate that that's really not that much strength training that you have to do. That can very easily be done with just 2 30-minute sessions per week. For endurance training, it's a little bit harder to really give a very nice, clean answer, because there's not any single unit of measurement we can use to sort of quantify volume of endurance. At least there's different measurements you can use for different purposes. For the sake of today, we'll just use time as the unit of measurement, because that's kind of the most relevant thing to our discussion here. And typically what you tend to find when you look at studies that are sort of trying to elucidate this is that 60 minutes per week is the number that pops up most often. Now, it matters how these 60 minutes are done. So if you do these 60 minutes at a relatively easy intensity, you're probably not going to get too much adaptation or too much results from that. We're going to talk about that a bit later. I have a whole slide on that topic in particular. But again, hopefully you can appreciate that 60 minutes across an entire week is very manageable for most people to fit into their schedule. And again, this too, obviously, can be done with just 2 30-minute sessions in the week. So as we move into these programming tactics for a minimalist approach to hypertraining, or minimum effective dose, is what I sort of mean to say with that there. These are all things that are true for any program or any training regimen you're going to undergo. And they should be thought of for any type of training you're going to do. I just think they become that much more important in the context of when you're trying to train as little in the week as possible while still seeing results. So we'll go through each one of these one by one. So when I talk about goal setting, what I'm really saying is try to be very clear with what it is you're trying to achieve out of your training. In the context of a hybrid approach to training, typically that means is one type of strength goal and one endurance goal. So for example, don't just say that you want to lift weights. Say you want to take a bodybuilding approach, a powerlifting approach, an Olympic lifting approach, something like that. For endurance, don't just say that you are going to run. Say you're going to train the 5K, the 10K. You're going to build how much you can run in a single session. The real point here is that there is no wrong answer to this question. And there are endless answers you can come up with to what your goals are going to be. But you do need an answer to this. Because if you're going to be training just 2 to 3 times in the week, you don't really have the time available to not be targeted with what you select to do and still see the results that you probably want to see. So ideally with your training, you are following, let's say, some type of training block right now where the weekly or the training week looks relatively the same week after week. There are planned progressions to the training week as each week progresses. And then you follow that for a period of 4, 6, 8 weeks, something like that. And then you cycle through training blocks, hopefully with each training block building off the previous one and being written with the next one and the ones down in mind. For the most part, that's what it means to think long-term with your training. And just to give you an example, let's say that your strength goal that you selected with the previous slide was to get stronger at the deadlift specifically. And, for the sake of this example, let's assume that you're not just training the deadlift, but that's your primary focus. You're going to train your other muscles, obviously, but getting stronger at deadlift is priority number 1. There's a wide variety of different accessory type movements that you can do for the deadlift, with one being more or less appropriate for you based on, whatever the weakest part of the movement is for you. So maybe your lower back is the weak link in the chain, maybe your glutes or hamstrings, maybe your upper back, maybe there's a certain part of the range of motion you find more difficult than another. The point is that there's a lot of accessories that you can toss in that would benefit your deadlift, but you're not going to have time in 2 to 3 days per week to toss all of them into the program. I mean, that's typically true for really any training program, but that's especially true for a minimalist approach. So what you would do is you would select, let's say, for the deadlift still, whatever the weakest part of the movement is for you. And from there, you select an accessory movement that's going to target that weak link in the chain. You keep that in the training block for, again, period of 4, 6, 8 weeks, something like that. Presumably at the end of that period, that's no longer the weak part of your movement, at which point something else would be the weak link in the chain, given that previous weak one became stronger, and you would choose a new accessory to target that new weak link, and so on and so on. So the result is that no individual training week is going to necessarily constitute a complete training program, but when you stack these training blocks on top of one another, you functionally, over a longer period of time, end up having a complete training program. And this, in my opinion, is really, where putting some forethought into your training and into your programming will give you the results that you're really after. So when we talk about exercise selection for resistance training, really what I'm saying is that any exercise that you select to do has to give you enough benefit for the time you spend doing it. So single leg or single arm training or isolation training, stuff like that is great and has its place, and you're going to need to incorporate it in some way, shape, or form over time. But if there's too much of it in the program, then you're not going to really be able to fit all of that into just 2 to 3 days per week of training. So you need to be a little more ruthless by what exercises you select in, let's say, a single 30-minute resistance training session. The movements are going to have to be, one, very targeted and specific to the goal that we set previously, and two, they'll probably need to be multi-joint compound type of exercises. And again, I'm not saying that you would never do single leg or single arm training or isolation training, like isolated arm training, but you're not going to have time to fit a lot of it in. And this is really where long-term thinking comes back into play, where you might select 1 or 2 to have in the program, keep those in for, let's say 1 to 2 training blocks, and then cycle this out for others as other types of isolation or single arm or single leg training become higher priority. But again, at least 3/4 of your resistance training should be made up of stuff up here, so multi-joint compound type exercises that are targeted and specific to the goals you set, and less than 1/4 or a quarter, again, not hard numbers I'm giving you here, but about a quarter or less should be made up of stuff down here. So I did recently publish an entire other video on supersets specifically, so I'm not going to spend too much time here. I'll link that video somewhere here, maybe down below, maybe in this video, so you have a link to that. But I do think this is probably the most time-saving and most effective and efficient tactic you can use when you're programming your strength training. So a superset is basically when you go back and forth between 2 different exercises, as opposed to doing straight sets of a single exercise. So instead of doing just 3 sets of bench press, where you probably would be resting 2 to 3 minutes in between sets in order to really rest enough to make each set as effective and as high quality as you can, you would instead go back and forth between, let's say, bench press and rows, where you're resting just 30 seconds to a minute in between sets. And the idea is that while you're doing a bench press, the muscles responsible for a row are functionally resting. This shorter rest period is still enough for your sort of cardiovascular system to catch up and recover enough for the next set, so that ends up not being too much of an issue. A session can feel subjectively more difficult this way, but there is good research to show, as I note up here, that you can cut your sessions down to about half the time that you normally would, while still making the same gains in terms of muscle growth than you would with straight sets. Now, again, to save time in this video, I do have an entire other video where I go into this topic in much more detail, because I do think it's that worthwhile to really be solid on how to do this right. So I'll link that down below or up here, so you can check that out if you want. The last thing I'm going to recommend you consider when it comes to strength training is to use drop sets in your training. And what a drop set is you're performing an exercise, let's say a machine chest press, and you're using 100 pounds. You take that set to about near failure, at which point you immediately lower the weight about 30%. So in this case, it would be to 70 pounds. And you immediately keep going for more reps and taking that again to near failure. The idea here is that one set, for the most part, turns into 2 sets for really not that much time added, because you're spending just that much more time in that proximity to failure. And again, there's good research behind this training tactic here, where when you compare people who perform the same volume of strength training, subjects who performed all of that strength training using only drop sets typically will see the same growth in muscle in about 1/3 of the training time than those who only used straight sets. And with this, you can get a little bit creative. So if we're going to stay with the chest as an example, a machine chest press would be very easy, because, or if it's a pin loaded one at least, because you can just take the pin out, put it down as your drop in weight, and then keep going that way. However, you can also use what's called mechanical drop sets, where let's say you are doing push-ups, and you do those sets of push-ups to about near failure. There's no real weight for you to lower. There's no pin for you to change. So what you can do instead is put your knees down and go immediately into knee push-ups, and then keep going to failure in that way. Or as another example, let's say you're doing a dumbbell fly on a flat bench, and you take that to near failure. You can immediately just bend your elbows, go into a dumbbell bench press. And even though the weight is the same, it feels much lighter on your chest because the lever arm becomes much shorter, and it still serves as somewhat of a mechanical drop set. And now, do understand, I put 30% drop right here. It doesn't really need to be that. That's just what they typically use in the research when they study this, but it just has to be a drop where the weight becomes low enough where you can perform a meaningful number of extra reps on top of the initial set you did. And as I note down here, this can be stacked on top of supersets if you really want to save just that much more time. So when it comes to exercise selection for endurance training, in the context of a minimalist approach to training, especially a minimalist hybrid approach to your training, there's really not enough time in the week to do anything other than what your endurance goal is. So for instance, if your endurance goal that you set was running of any way, shape, or form, then I don't think there's good rationale to do anything other than running as your form of endurance training. If you ended up deciding that general aerobic development, like you just want to develop your cardiovascular system in general, which again is a fine goal, there is no wrong answer as long as that is the identified goal, then there can be some considerations such as using a mix of exercises, so you're not too specific into one form of aerobic endurance training, using full body aerobic training at least in some part of your program, such as a skier, such as a rower, an airdyne, stuff like that, so that those site specific aerobic adaptations are occurring everywhere in the body. But again, we're going to finish this video off with some example training splits, so we'll discuss that a bit more once we get there. So when it comes to endurance training, one of the first most basic recommendations people will give in order to improve your endurance in any mode of endurance training is to just rack up as much volume as you possibly can. And typically that's going to be done at a low intensity, because otherwise, if you did all your volume at a high intensity and you want to do a high volume of training, you just physiologically can't do that. And that's why you see so much hoopla about zone 2 training, low heart rate training online, because that sort of intensity is high enough to elicit meaningful adaptations in your aerobic endurance fitness, but not so high that it really requires any recovery time. So the result is that you can rack up a ton of volume doing it without feeling like you got run over by a truck every day. However, when the goal is to train as little as possible in the week, obviously that's not really an option here. So since you can't cash in on volume, you must cash in on intensity. And what I mean by that is whatever duration of endurance training you decide to allocate, or whatever time in the week you decide to allocate toward endurance training, you should try to get as much work done within that training time as you can. So for instance, if you end up programming 10 minutes on an assault bike at the end of a strength training workout as part of your endurance training regimen, then those 10 minutes should not be done at an easy intensity. You should be huffing and puffing a little bit. You should be trying to get as much work done, as much distance covered as you can within those 10 minutes if you want to see as much results as possible. And going back to what we talked about earlier, when you look at these studies where they show people making good progress in endurance with just 60 minutes per week of training, those 60 minutes across the week are done at very high intensities. Most of the studies are done at around 80 to 90% of the subject's VO2 max, which is near maximum effort. So bottom line, when it comes to minimalist hybrid training, my recommendation is to forget that zone 2 or low heart training even exists. You don't have time for it. Any endurance training that you do should be done at the highest intensity that you can sustain for whatever that period of time is. So it's worth noting that you can get endlessly creative with how you structure your training split to sort of best match your lifestyle, your goals, your preferences, all that sort of stuff. But in terms of fixed, nice, clean structures, there's two that I'm going to talk about in this video. So the first is to combine strength and conditioning. And I'm using conditioning and endurance training somewhat simultaneously in this context. But to combine those two types of training in every session. And then if you're training in this way, you can, train this way 2 to 3 times per week, let's say, ideally with at least one rest day in between, because you don't want to train any muscle at a high intensity 2 days in a row, typically. So that's split one, where pretty much every session is the same in terms of, what modes or what features of fitness are being trained. The second one I'm going to recommend is more of a mixed structure. So there could be one combined strength and conditioning day, S&C is what that means, which would be the same as what these sessions are. Then there could be one lift only, and then one endurance day only. And then obviously by nature, this is sort of fixed at 3 days per week. And there's never any right or wrong answer why you would choose one training split over the other. If your total weekly volume ends up looking the same, it's unlikely you're going to see any differences in the results you see with different training splits. So in terms of, which one you select, preference should be a big dictator of your choice there. Apart from that though, if you need more flexibility in the week, like if life might get in the way, if you might miss a session here and there, or if you just need to, be able to move things around a bit more freely, then I would go with this first option, the combined strength and conditioning session, or in every session. But if you like to have a bit more variety with what your training sessions look like, or if you have some sort of identifiable event coming up, like a 5K, then I would go for this second option, because especially if you have some sort of specified event you're training for, having this pure endurance day or pure lift day can be helpful for that. So I won't read straight through these. You can pause if you want to read the specific movements, workouts, stuff like that. I'll just speak to some of the thought that went behind it. So to start, obviously a lot of detail missing, because all the other detail that I would put in a training week would be dependent upon personal context, and without knowing you, I wouldn't be able to really accurately do that. So the sort of preset goals for this training week would be just general muscle building and general aerobic development. Again, not wrong goals, just as long as there is an identified goal you're aiming at. And that's really why there's a good bit of variety in terms of what modes of endurance training are being used here. I have an entire other article about why I would start the workouts with some type of power training, so I'll link that down below, because that's kind of an entire other discussion. But just looking at these two sessions, session 1 here on the left can be done on a Monday. This can be done on a Thursday. You would do these for a period of 4, 6, 8 weeks, something like that, and then cycle through into a different training week and progress that new training week. If you wanted to add a third session on top of this, so you wanted to do like a Monday, Wednesday, Friday sort of schedule, in that case, you could add a third session that looks, functionally just the same way that these look, or you could add just a pure endurance session, like a 30-minute easy run, or 30-minute tempo run. I meant to say, not easy run, something like that. And also briefly, RPE down here just stands for rate of perceived exertion. It's a fancy way of saying how hard I would recommend you try on a scale from 1 to 10. So when I say RPE 7 to 8, I'm saying you put in 7 to 8 out of 10 effort throughout these 10 minutes here. And then I used RPE here instead of, specific pace or anything like that, because that's the easiest way for me to make this generalizable to everyone watching this. So here's the second training week. Again, the strength training goal would be general muscle building, whereas the endurance goal in this one would be just purely running. As you can see, most of the movements are, as far as strength goes, are going to be compound, multi-joint, stuff like that. There are some isolation stuff in here, but ideally these would be cycled through for other stuff as you go along, different training blocks. Again, as you can see, almost everything that can be supersetted is supersetted for the sake of saving time. And you could turn any of these into a drop set if you wanted to try and get just that much more out of it. So with all that said, I'm going to end this video right here. I hope you found that somewhat helpful, interesting, or somewhere in between. If you have any questions, comments, concerns about anything that I said in this video, don't hesitate to comment down below, and I will get back to you as soon as I can. Hope you have a great day, and I will talk to you soon.